You're listening to Audiology. Support our work on Patreon and be sure to submit your requests for topics in the comments below. Now presenting the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk. The Brest-Litovsk Treaty, sealed on March 3, 1918, marked Soviet Russia's exit from World War I as it forged an agreement with the Central Powers, including Germany, Austria-Hungary, the Ottoman Empire, and Bulgaria. The peace deal, secured in Brest-Litovsk, modern-day Brest, Belarus, followed extensive talks succeeding a ceasefire on the Eastern Front in late 1917. Initially, the Soviet team was led by Adolf Joffe. However, prominent negotiators from the Central Powers were German representatives Max Hoffmann and Richard von Kuhlmann, Austria-Hungary's Ottokar Czernin, and the Ottoman Empire's Talat Pasha. As negotiations stretched into January 1918, the Central Powers demanded Russia relinquish all territories they had occupied. In response, Leon Trotsky took charge of a fresh Soviet delegation seeking to delay proceedings in anticipation of potential revolts in Central Europe. A Central Powers offensive in February pushed the Soviets into a position where they felt compelled to negotiate a peace settlement. Russia made significant territorial sacrifices under the treaty's conditions, surrendering lands now known as Ukraine, Poland, Belarus, the Baltic states, Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia, and Caucasus regions like Kars and Batum. This entailed losing large chunks of its population and resources, including over half of its industrial zones and the majority of its coal regions. Furthermore, the Soviet regime acknowledged Finland's independence, previously recognized in January of the same year, and agreed to stop hostilities with the Ukrainian People's Republic, which the Central Powers had acknowledged in a separate earlier treaty, February 9, 1918. Additional agreements in August committed Russia to paying hefty war reparations to Germany. This treaty was highly contentious within Russia, presenting a rallying point for opposition white forces and creating a split within the Bolsheviks, provoking the left socialist revolutionaries to exit the ruling coalition and later revolt. However, the treaty was rendered void by the November 11, 1918 armistice, with Germany's defeat by Allied forces. Soviet attempts to regain control over the lost territories during the Russian Civil War yielded mixed outcomes. They failed to reclaim independence in the three Baltic nations, and Poland yet succeeded in reasserting themselves in Azerbaijan, Armenia, Georgia, and in the conflict with Ukraine. The border with Turkey from the Brest-Litovsk Treaty was mostly reaffirmed in 1921's Treaty of Kars, and by the 1922 Treaty of Rapallo, Germany and Russia mutually abandoned any territorial and financial claims. Interestingly, the territorial outlines decided by the Brest-Litovsk Treaty closely match the frontiers of the post-Soviet states that emerged after the USSR dissolved in 1991. Part 1. Background. By 1917, the conflict between Germany and Russia had reached a deadlock on the World War I Eastern Front, with the Russian economic structure on the brink of failure due to the war's demands. Russia was plagued by extensive casualties, widespread hunger, and political turmoil in its cities, culminating in the February Revolution that ousted Tsar Nicholas II. The interim government that took over continued the war effort, and its foreign minister Pavel Milyukov confirmed to the Allies through a telegram, commonly referred to as the Milyukov Note, that Russia would maintain its wartime objectives as previously set. However, this government faced opposition from the Petrograd Soviet, controlled by leftist groups, which demanded greater authority for soldiers' committees over military officers and began forming the Red Guards in March 1917. With the continuation of the war, Germany decided to support the Bolsheviks, who advocated for Russia's exit from the conflict. Consequently, in April 1917, Germany arranged for the return of Bolshevik leader Vladimir Lenin and his associates from Switzerland to Petrograd by train. Upon arrival, Lenin broadcast his radical April thesis, urging the transfer of power to the workers' and soldiers' councils and an immediate ceasefire. Around the same period, the United States joined the conflict, altering the dynamics of the war against the Central Powers. Over the year, the Bolsheviks intensified their campaign to topple the provisional rulers and end the war, especially following the collapse of military discipline after a failed offensive led by Alexander Kerensky. The ongoing defeat and suffering triggered anti-government protests in Petrograd, known as the July Days of 1917. By November, October in the old-style calendar, the Bolsheviks took over the Winter Palace and captured the provisional leaders in what is now called the October Revolution. Immediately upon seizing power, the new Soviet regime prioritized exiting the war. On November 8, 1917, October 26, Old Style, Lenin enacted the Decree on Peace, endorsed by the Second All-Russian Congress of Soviets, appealing for peace talks and Russia's withdrawal from the war. Leon Trotsky was assigned to lead foreign affairs, and he delegated his close associate Adolf Joffe to represent the Bolsheviks in the ensuing peace negotiations with German and other Central Power officials. Part 2: Peace Negotiations. On December 15, 1917, a ceasefire was agreed upon between Soviet Russia and the Central Powers. A week later, detailed peace talks started in the city of Brest-Litovsk. These talks were managed by General Max Hoffman, who was in charge of the Central Powers' military operations on the Eastern Front. The negotiating teams were strengthened following the armistice, with high-ranking officials such as the German and Austro-Hungarian foreign ministers, along with representatives from the Ottoman Empire and Bulgaria, joining the discussions. The Soviets were represented by Adolf Joffe and his team, which had been streamlined to exclude most group representatives and bolstered with experts like General Alexander Samoylo and historian Mikhail Pokrovsky. Despite internal conflicts among the delegates, they were hosted in makeshift accommodations by the Germans, where they also dined together congenially. The conference kicked off with the Germans asking the Soviets to outline their peace terms. Joffe proposed 6 points, echoing the Bolshevik ideal of a peace agreement that involved no territorial gains or reparations. The Central Powers agreed in principle, with the condition that all nations involved in the war would make the same pledge. However, misunderstandings arose regarding this agreement, as Russia's interpretation was overly optimistic. The Central Powers intended to allow certain regions under their occupation, like Poland, Lithuania, and Courland, to have self-determination, which effectively meant detaching them from Russia. This revelation caused significant distress among the Soviet delegation. Amidst these challenging negotiations, political changes were taking place. The German military leadership had internal disagreements about the extent of territorial claims in Poland. Also, the delegation from the newly independent Ukraine appeared, seeking peace in exchange for food supplies. When discussions resumed, Leon Trotsky, succeeding Joffe, withdrew from the social aspect of the talks and addressed substantial ideological issues, delaying the negotiations. Despite this, the Central Powers managed to sign a separate treaty with Ukraine. To advance the stalled negotiations with the Soviets, Hoffman turned the discussions towards the demarcation of boundaries. Trotsky described the dire situation as significant territories being severed from Russia. Back in Petrograd, there was intense debate over signing the peace treaty. Lenin was convinced that they had to sign to avoid a more disastrous outcome, but others believed in continuing the fight, hoping for imminent revolutions in the enemy nations. Trotsky proposed to cease war operations without formally signing a treaty. However, the stalling tactic was short-lived. German forces soon resumed their offensive. Lenin, under the threat of German ultimatums and his own possible resignation, convinced the Central Committee to sign the peace treaty. The Brest-Litovsk Treaty was ultimately signed under duress by the Soviets on March 3, 1918, without any further negotiation on the terms, effectively capitulating to the conditions set forth by the Central Powers. Part 3: Terms. The Treaty of Brest-Litovsk was concluded on March 3, 1918, with Soviet Russia, represented by Grigory Sokolnikov, on one side, and the powers of the German Empire, Austria-Hungary, Bulgaria, and the Ottoman Empire on the other. This agreement culminated in Russia's exit from World War I, though it came at a steep price, stripping away sizable chunks of the former Russian Empire. Russia had to cede territories comprising a quarter of its inhabitants, a significant portion of its industrial resources, and almost all of its coal fields. As part of the treaty, Russia had to relinquish control over several nations, including Finland, whose independence Russia had previously acknowledged, as well as Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, the majority of Belarus, and Ukraine. Although the future of the Polish territory was not specified due to the German refusal to engage with Polish representation, leading to Polish objections, the agreement did spell out that Germany and Austria-Hungary would determine the future of these areas in consultation with the local populations. The plan involved setting up economic and political dependencies in these territories, with German minorities in influential positions. Notably, Germany intended to install puppet monarchies in Lithuania and the United Baltic Duchy, comprising Latvia and Estonia. However, the German-appointed aristocrats never effectively ruled these areas. German Colonel General Erich Ludendorff outlined an ambition to exert a protective influence over all German nationals in these regions. The German military occupation of parts of the former Russian Empire was a significant strain, involving over 1 million soldiers extended across a vast expanse and depleting resources needed elsewhere, notably in France. Efforts to harness Ukraine's resources were unsuccessful, and resistance from local populations grew. German forces faced revolts across the occupied lands, and Bolshevik influence exacerbated the instability. German troops were also involved in the Finnish Civil War, and fears of Bolshevik propaganda affecting German soldiers were one of the factors impeding troop movements to the Western Front. German attempts to establish a puppet Ukrainian state faltered as well, and notions of advancing on Bolshevik centers like Moscow were dismissed. Germany was compelled to redeploy hundreds of thousands of experienced soldiers to the Western Front for the failed 1918 Spring Offensive. Following this, Germany began the gradual process of withdrawing from the East. In the wake of Germany's retreat, local independence movements in Belarus, Ukraine, and other areas filled the void, leading to the establishment of new national states. Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Belarus, Ukraine, and Poland emerged as independent entities, with Bessarabia joining Romania. Alongside territorial losses, Russia faced severe economic repercussions, including the relinquishment of a significant share of its population, industrial areas, coal mines, and railways, as well as the imposition of a fine of 300 million gold marks. In the Caucasus region, Russia was compelled by the Turks to vacate territories captured during the Russo-Turkish War of 1877 to 1878, specifically Ardahan, Kars, and Batumi, areas that were under Armenian and Georgian control at the time. According to the treaty, local populations would handle their affairs without Russian intervention, with the understanding that they would coordinate with neighboring states, especially the Ottoman Empire. In defiance of the treaty, Armenia, Azerbaijan, and Georgia declared their independence and established the ephemeral Transcaucasian Democratic Federative Republic. Later in August 1918, amidst the nationalization of assets and the landing of Entente forces on Russian soil, the Soviets and Germans entered into a supplementary financial agreement. The Soviets consented to pay Germany 6 billion marks as reparation for losses incurred by Germans due to Russian actions. This sum was also intended to offset any existing claims by Russia and account for confiscated goods in Russia by German military forces. Furthermore, the Soviets agreed to sell Germany a quarter of the oil production from the Baku fields. There were additional secret clauses that allowed for German military intervention against Entente forces on Russian territory and the removal of British forces from Baku. Part 4: Lasting Effects. The treaty facilitated Germany's ability to continue its efforts in World War I by allowing it to redistribute a significant number of troops to the Western Front, while also stripping Russia of substantial resources, including food, industry, fuel, and European communication channels. Historian Spencer Tucker argues that the Allies viewed this agreement as a grave betrayal that laid the groundwork for later Cold War tensions. They perceived the potential rise of German power in Eastern Europe as a serious threat, which spurred discussions of possible military intervention in Russia. For Germany, the conditions it imposed on Russia through the treaty were a message to the Allies of the harsh terms they could expect if the Central Powers were victorious. As the Western Front situation intensified, there were voices within the German administration who suggested offering more amiable conditions to the Allies in return for recognizing their acquisitions in the East. From the Bolshevik standpoint, the treaty significantly reduced their territorial hold, which had been established by the Russian Empire. Although they had already acknowledged Poland's independence and accepted Finland's autonomy, the loss of areas like Ukraine and the Baltics was a blow that led to bases of anti-Bolshevik activity during the subsequent Russian Civil War. These territorial losses incited both Russian nationalists and some revolutionaries to actively oppose the Bolsheviks, while various ethnic groups saw an opportunity for independence in the disintegration of the former Russian territories. Following the treaty, Lenin preemptively moved the Soviet government from Petrograd to Moscow to safeguard it from any potential German offensive. Trotsky blamed the treaty on various factors and groups, including the bourgeoisie and other political figures, and the treaty deepened the division between the Bolsheviks and the left socialist revolutionaries. The latter even assassinated the German ambassador in hopes of causing the treaty to be discarded, an act that led to an uprising. The relationship between Russia and the Central Powers remained turbulent. The Ottoman Empire violated the agreement by attacking the First Republic of Armenia. Joff, the Russian ambassador to Germany, focused on fomenting revolution in Germany, but was expelled when his subversive activities were uncovered. The Brest-Litovsk Treaty was later voided by the Armistice of November 11, 1918, which ended World War I, and formally annulled by the Bolshevik legislature shortly thereafter. Post-armistice, as the German forces withdrew from territories acquired through the treaty, the region's future and the Soviet Union's western border were subjects of violent struggles, notably the bitter Polish-Soviet War, which concluded with the Treaty of Riga in 1921. While most of Ukraine and Belarus came under Bolshevik control, Poland and the Baltic states re-established their independence. The Treaty of Rapallo in 1922 saw Germany and the nascent Soviet Union renounce claims against each other. These boundaries stood until World War II, when the Soviet Union, under the Nazi-Soviet Pact, expanded westward into Poland, parts of Finland, and the Baltic states, reclaiming most of the territory it had lost during the Brest-Litovsk Treaty, with some exceptions.